On Wednesday, March 11, 2015, the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago hosted a roundtable discussion on Post Legislative Scrutiny. This form of oversight will assist the Parliament in reviewing legislation in order to determine if its policy objectives have been achieved and to what extent. The Parliamentary Roundtable was coordinated by the United Nations Development Programme and featured several external contributors who shared their experience and knowledge on post-legislative scrutiny. What is post-legislative scrutiny and what benefits can this form of oversight bring to the Parliament?
Post-legislative scrutiny involves assessing how well a piece of law has worked, whether it achieves the objectives that Parliament set out when it first set that law into statute. And the benefits that that can bring to a Parliament is really that it brings benefits to the nation. So it may be that post-legislative scrutiny can reveal where an Act of Parliament is not achieving its objectives, so it's failing in some way, it's failing the population. Or it could be identifying where there have been unintended consequences through passing an Act. It may be achieving what it set out to do, but it's had some negative consequences as well that were not anticipated, not intended. So through a process of review and evaluation, a Parliament can try to eradicate those weaknesses within the legislation and therefore make people's lives better. And we also hope that through post-legislative scrutiny, we actually improve the legislative process itself. So as members of Parliament become more expert and more experienced in judging how well a law has worked, they will also become more expert in judging whether a potential law will work.
Has post-legislative scrutiny been effective in the UK Parliament?
I think I would say we're getting there. We are in the early days of doing this, and despite the Westminster Parliament's long history, post-legislative scrutiny isn't something that we've done in any formal sense for many years, but we have had some successes along the way. We introduced a new, more formal system in 2009, and we have now been through the process around 15 to 20 times of evaluating a particular piece of law. And there have been occasions where that's resulted in improvements, and certainly there have been cases where that's resulted in members becoming far more expert in judging law.
What are some of the key elements that must be considered before implementing post-legislative scrutiny in any Parliament?
Well, I think one of the key things that would have to be looked into is whether the process can be adequately handled by legislative scrutiny of any and all legislation on an ad hoc basis, or whether there is indeed a group of legislation or legislative initiatives that invites the insertion of sunset clauses which guarantee post-legislative scrutiny. A sunset clause is a provision that is inserted into proposed legislation that obliges review of the entire piece of legislation or certain provisions thereof at some future date, fixed date, 3, 5, sometimes 10 years, and invites a reconsideration of the legislation or provision thereof and its termination, its amendment, or its continuation as is, depending on the circumstances then obtaining.
Should post-legislative scrutiny be used to monitor all legislation?
It would be useful, I suppose, for laws that have been neglected, but I think it's more appropriate to target sunset clauses on 3 particular kinds of legislation as they are being developed. Legislation that gives or grants greater powers to the government versus the rights and freedoms of individuals. Situations where certain foundational pieces of legislation are used by the country but must be maintained and updated to address changing circumstances. For example, legislation that deals with banks, trust companies, that sort of thing. And a third example that often invites the insertion of sunset clauses is legislation which deals with new kinds of situations, new kinds of technologies where the outcomes are not immediately clear. For example, assisted human reproduction technologies. And I think those three areas are the chief areas where the use of sunset clauses is most invited.
How can the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago avoid the possible limitations of this form of oversight?
It does require a certain discipline. And I think to achieve that, to make sure that your post-legislative scrutiny actually looks at whether the law is working, rather than reopening the whole policy debate that led to the law being put on the statute book in the first place, one of the keys to that is actually having a process that everybody's agreed on. So that the initial questions that you ask at the outset, which may be done at official level rather than by politicians, is actually all about the technical detail of the law. Of course, the answers to those questions may open up a wider policy debate, and that's entirely appropriate. If the issues that those questions throw up actually are about the technical detail of the law, then it's quite easy to keep it within that field.
What other mechanisms can be used to strengthen Parliament's scrutiny role over the executive?
Parliaments bring a unique added value to a scrutiny process. Anyone can evaluate whether a government law has worked well, whether a policy has been implemented well, whether they're administering funds well. An academic could do it, a researcher could do it, a foundation, a think tank. The unique value that a parliament brings is the actual input of politicians, of being directly elected by the people, reflecting people's priorities, and having that democratic legitimacy around their activities. So the starting place for strengthening parliamentary scrutiny has to be with enabling members to do that job well. That might be around helping them make time to do it, because time is always the biggest constraint on any member of parliament and what they can do on any parliament, how much time there is. But there is also an area where scrutiny is at its most effective, where it is done in a more collaborative, consensual way. There is no point in going into a scrutiny exercise if the outcome is predetermined along the party lines of the members of parliament who are doing it. So we work very hard to try and make our scrutiny system work in a more collaborative, cross-party way. And we do that through changing the infrastructure of the rooms we use. So when we're passing laws, we'll have members of parliament sitting opposite each other in a more confrontational manner. When they're doing scrutiny, we have them sitting round a table. And little things can be done to change the tone. But also the relationship with government is very important. And they're establishing a willingness that government is open to being scrutinised in that way is also a key part of making scrutiny effective. Because for all the effort we put into it, a parliament puts into it, if the government isn't going to listen to those recommendations or act on them at the end of the process, then really we haven't achieved what we set out to do. So trying to do it in a non-confrontational, collaborative manner and engaging all the stakeholders is really important.
During the presentation that we had during the roundtable, I talked about a tool called the Community Scorecard. This is a tool that can be used by many different actors, by government institutions, NGOs, and other actors. And the Parliamentary Centre has used it with parliaments and members of parliament, parliamentary staff, etc., to help them and perform both outreach responsibilities, but also oversight in looking both at legislation, but particularly government services that are linked to certain acts and legislation, and also the budget. It can be quite effective in terms of a tool to facilitate discussion, because it brings together community members at the very local level and the providers in a dialogue that is facilitated through either parliamentary staff, but also with the help of universities and other organizations that have a very good understanding of the local context. So for citizen engagement and for oversight, it can be a powerful tool.
Closing statements.
When it comes to parliaments like the one here in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, you have to look at multiple tools that work in the context you're in. One tool won't be the solution. One aspect that can be learned from another country might have to be adjusted and to work in this situation. Our experience with the community scorecard is that it is a very flexible, very cost-effective tool, and it can be used for multiple uses. It can help the oversight role of Parliament, it can help the representation role, but also help influence better decision-making in the future. So I think when you're looking for the tools that will be to your advantage, make sure that they can perform multiple things to be as cost-effective as possible.
Sunset clauses are useful in and of themselves in terms of the quality of the legislation, and to ensure that the quality remains high and that it remains responsive to the public over a course of years. But the use of sunset clauses also contributes to the integrity of the overall parliamentary process.